I cannot leave the house without spending $300.
Americans are leaving this country in record numbers. And I'm not talking about vacation. I'm talking packing their bags, booking their flights, and leaving.
They come to mock it. Europeans arrive with the same quiet certainty that the American dream is over, a relic, a slogan sold mostly to tourists now. Then they walk into a parking lot the size of a small town, in front of a store stocked floor to ceiling with more than any household could ever need, and somehow still cheap. They laugh, they film it, they call it excess. But something follows them home that they didn't come looking for. A question about why this still works here and not there. Not the mansions, not the millions. Something smaller and harder to fake. A house with room to breathe. A doctor who sees you next week instead of next year. A payment that never changes for 30 years straight. 7 quiet advantages, nothing dramatic on the surface, ordinary even to the people living inside them. And that's exactly the point, because the real American dream was never the exception, it was always the average day. Ask an American what a good store looks like, and convenience comes before quality, before price, before almost anything else. Open late, open early, open really, all the time. That instinct shows up everywhere, but nowhere more visibly than in a place like Costco or Walmart. Buildings the size of airport terminals, parking lots wide enough to swallow a small town's worth of cars, aisles stretching further than most European grocery stores in their entirety. European visitors film it like a novelty, a meat aisle longer than their local supermarket back home, ice cream in tubs instead of pints, batteries sold 40 to a pack. One traveler simply stops talking mid-video and lets the camera do the explaining, holding up a pack of ground beef that runs from his shoulder to his hip. But the size is only the most photogenic part of a much larger habit. Step outside the store and the same logic keeps repeating. Pharmacies stay open through the night. Fast food chains run entire menus through a car window without a single person stepping outside. A defective toaster gets refunded at the counter with no receipt, no argument, sometimes no reason given at all. None of this reads as remarkable to the people living inside it, which is exactly the point. Convenience here isn't a perk added on top of daily life. It's the baseline life gets built around. Much of that baseline traces back to geography and policy working together. Wide American suburbs made room for stores the size of small stadiums. Permissive zoning let them sit on cheap land at the edge of town. Supply chains built for a continent-sized country learned to move enormous volume cheaply. And volume is what makes low prices, long hours, and easy returns possible in the first place. European cities built inside centuries-old footprints, with dense zoning and stores designed around foot traffic instead of car trunks, were simply never engineered for the same math. So when a European films a Costco run in disbelief, the real story isn't the size of the meat aisle. It's a country that quietly decided, decades ago, that nobody should have to wait, plan ahead, or make do, and then built its entire retail landscape to make good on that decision. Ask an American what keeps a house livable in July, and the answer comes without a second thought. Ask the same question across most of Europe, and it suddenly turns into a debate. Nearly 9 out of 10 American households run air conditioning as a matter of course, built into new construction, replaced without ceremony the moment it breaks, treated with the same indifference as a refrigerator. Cross the Atlantic, and the picture flips almost entirely. Roughly 1 in 5 European homes has any air conditioning at all. In the UK, in Germany, in France, that number drops closer to 1 in 20. For most of the 20th century, that gap looked like a matter of taste, not necessity. European summers stayed mild enough that a few warm weeks felt like a minor inconvenience rather than a design flaw. Homes were built to hold heat in through long winters, not release it during short summers. Thick walls, small windows, little ventilation. It was a reasonable bet on a climate that no longer quite exists, because the climate underneath that bet has shifted. Europe is now warming at roughly twice the global average rate, and each summer's heat wave is exposing just how unready that older architecture really is. Hospitals without cooling systems, schools closing midweek, emergency lines overwhelmed by calls that, in an American city built for heat decades ago, would barely register as a bad afternoon. The The deeper reason isn't stubbornness or taste, it's timing. American cooling became standard because American summers demanded it early, and an entire industry, an entire building code grew up around meeting that demand. Europe simply never had the same incentive, until now. Retrofitting a continent's worth of centuries-old buildings for a problem that arrived only in the last decade is a far slower fix than installing a unit in a house that was designed for one from the start. So the gap isn't about comfort as a luxury. It's about which country was forced to solve a problem first, and which one is only now finding out it has the same problem to solve. There's a version of the healthcare debate that gets repeated so often it stopped being questioned. Universal coverage means fast, free care, and the American system means paying a fortune for the privilege of skipping the line. The reality, once the numbers are laid side by side, turns out to be messier than either side of that argument wants to admit. Start with what actually happens after a referral. In the United States, roughly 70% of patients see a specialist within 4 weeks of being referred by their primary doctor. Scheduled surgery, a hip replacement, a cataract procedure, a knee repair, averages around 28 days from decision to operating table. In Canada, fewer than 4 in 10 patients make it to a specialist inside that same 4-week window. In the UK, waits for non-emergency surgery can stretch past 6 months. And in the years following the pandemic, some specialties have seen that backlog grow rather than shrink. Spain, Portugal, and several other European systems report similar patterns. Care that is technically guaranteed on paper and practically delayed in practice. The reason isn't that European doctors are worse or American ones are better. It's structural. Systems funded and rationed centrally have to balance demand against a fixed public budget. And the balancing mechanism, more often than not, is time. A waiting list quietly absorbs the gap between what a system promises and what it can actually staff and fund in a given year. The American system, fragmented and privately financed as it is, doesn't ration the same way. Capacity gets built where money flows toward it, and specialists, private clinics, and surgical centers expand to meet demand rather than a fixed budget line. The result is a system that moves faster for the person already inside it. And that qualifier, already inside it, is where the American advantage stops being simple. Speed here is bought, not given. The same system that gets a patient into surgery in 28 days is the one where a single emergency room visit can generate a bill running into the thousands, where a missed insurance payment or a wrong network can turn a routine procedure into a financial event, and where roughly 1 in 10 working-age Americans still has no coverage at all heading into any given year. A European citizen waiting 8 months for a knee replacement is waiting inside a system that never asks whether they can pay for it. An American moving through that same procedure in under a month is moving through a system that already assumed somewhere upstream that they could. So the honest version of this fact isn't America wins, it's that 2 systems solved for 2 different failure points. Europe optimized against the risk of going bankrupt from illness and accepted the wait as the cost of that guarantee. America optimized against the wait and left the bill as the variable nobody fully controls. Neither country eliminated the trade-off. They just decided which half of it they'd rather live with. In most American households, owning a car isn't a decision. It's an assumption made before the first paycheck ever arrives. 2 cars in the driveway is the default, not the exception, across huge stretches of the country. Garages are built into the house itself, not rented separately 3 blocks away. Highways run wide and, for the most part, free of tolls, cutting through cities and open land alike without asking permission. A European visitor renting a car for the first time in Texas or Ohio often notices the same thing before anything else. The lanes are wider, the parking is free or nearly free, and nobody seems to be apologizing for driving everywhere. European cities tell a different story, and not by accident. Centuries-old street grids were never built with the automobile in mind. Parking in central Paris or Amsterdam can cost more per month than some American mortgage payments. Congestion charges, low emission zones, and deliberately narrow streets push residents toward trains, trams, and bicycles. A system that works remarkably well in dense, walkable cities, but starts to strain the moment someone needs to reach a town that isn't on a rail line. That difference didn't happen by coincidence. After the Second World War, the United States built its interstate highway system explicitly to move people and goods across vast distances, and suburbs grew up around the assumption that everyone would arrive by car. Europe, rebuilding older cities on older footprints, invested instead in dense public transit, a rational choice for countries where most people already lived close together. Neither decision was wrong. They were simply built for different maps. The trade-off shows up on both sides. American car dependency means higher household transportation costs, more time spent behind the wheel in cities that can feel hostile to anyone without a driver's license. European transit density means lower emissions and lower individual cost, but also a rigidity that a car never has. A schedule to catch, a station to reach, a last train that doesn't wait. What an American driver actually owns in the end isn't a car. It's the ability to leave at any hour in any direction without checking a timetable first. Whether that counts as freedom or just a bigger fuel bill depends entirely on which side of the Atlantic is asking the question. Buried inside almost every American home purchase is a financial product so ordinary to Americans that most never think to question it, and so unusual everywhere else that economists still write papers trying to explain it. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, a loan that locks in the same interest rate for 3 full decades, regardless of what happens to the economy in between. Roughly 9 out of 10 American homebuyers choose exactly this option. Almost nowhere else in the world is it even available in the same form. Canadian buyers typically lock a rate for 5 years, then refinance at whatever the market offers next. British buyers do the same, often on 2 to 5 year terms before rolling onto a lender's standard variable rate. Across most of continental Europe, long-term loans exist, but usually with steep penalties for paying them off early, or with rates that adjust well before the debt is settled. The combination America takes for granted, long-term, fixed rate, no penalty for paying it down faster, exists almost nowhere but here. The reason traces back to a specific decision, not a cultural instinct. In the years following the Great Depression, the U.S. government created institutions, later known as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, whose entire purpose was to buy mortgages from banks and repackage them for investors, freeing banks to keep lending and letting them offer a longer, safer loan than they could otherwise afford to hold on their own books. No other country built the same government-backed plumbing underneath its housing market at the same scale. Without a buyer of last resort absorbing the long-term risk, banks elsewhere have little incentive to lock in a rate for 30 years and hope inflation doesn't upend the bet. The upside is real and easy to underestimate. A young family locking in a payment in their late 20s knows, with total certainty, what their housing cost will be in their late 50s. Insulated from the sort of rate shocks that have forced British and European homeowners into sudden, sometimes brutal, jumps in their monthly payments when a fixed period ends and the loan resets. That certainty is, in its own quiet way, a form of the American dream that never needed a slogan. But the system isn't without its own distortion. Because the rate is fixed for so long, American homeowners have less incentive to move once they've locked in a low one, a phenomenon that, in recent years, has visibly slowed the housing market, as owners sit on properties rather than trade a low rate for a higher one elsewhere. The same stability that protects a family also, at scale, can freeze a market in place. So the 30-year mortgage isn't simply proof of American generosity or European caution. It's the product of one country deciding nearly a century ago to underwrite long-term certainty at a national level, and living, decades later, with both the security and the rigidity that decision built in. Somewhere behind almost every small town in the American West, there's a mountain, a forest, or a stretch of desert that technically belongs to no one, and in the same breath, belongs to everyone. Roughly a third of all land in the United States is publicly owned. The federal government alone holds close to 640 million acres, national forests, wildlife refuges, and more than 400 national parks and monuments, most of it open to hike, camp, or simply drive through for the price of a modest entrance fee, sometimes for nothing at all. Step into most of Western Europe, and the map looks fundamentally different. Land there has been divided, fenced, and privately held for centuries, farmed, inherited, sold, and resold long before the idea of a national park existed anywhere. Europe's protected areas tend to be smaller, more curated, often centered on a single landscape feature rather than the sprawling, drive-for-hours wilderness common across the American West. That difference isn't really about which continent values nature more. It's about which one had land left to set aside when the idea of protecting it finally caught on. The U.S. National Park System took shape in the late 1800s and early 1900s, carving out enormous tracts of a country still being settled, while much of Europe's land had already been claimed, farmed, and fenced for generations before conservation became a governing priority. By the time European nations began formally creating national parks after the Second World War, there was simply less untouched land left to protect at that scale, so protection there took the shape of managing what remained, rather than preserving what hadn't yet been divided up. The trade-off, again, cuts both ways. European nature, precisely because it's smaller and more managed, tends to be dense with history, old-growth forests threaded through centuries-old villages, coastlines dotted with towns rather than left empty. American wilderness, by contrast, can stretch for days without a settlement in sight, but that scale comes at the cost of infrastructure. Many of these public lands sit hours from the nearest town, reachable only by car, in a country that assumes everyone has one. What a hiker in Wyoming or Utah is really standing on, then, isn't just scenery. It's the leftover of a decision made over a century ago to draw a line around a third of a continent before anyone could buy it, fence it, or build on it first. Ask an American how long they've been at their job, and a surprising number will answer in months, not years. Ask why they left the last one, and the answer is rarely dramatic. A better offer came along, so they took it. On paper, the headline number looks simple. American workers earn a nominal average of around $80,000 a year, among the highest in the developed world. But that number, taken alone, tells only part of the story. Adjust for the cost of living, and the gap narrows considerably. A software engineer in Berlin or Amsterdam, after taxes and expenses, can end up with disposable income surprisingly close to, sometimes exceeding, a counterpart earning a larger salary in an expensive American city, so the real advantage isn't simply the paycheck. It's what happens after you're hired. American employment law makes it remarkably easy to hire, to fire, and to leave. Most jobs run on what's known as at-will employment. No lengthy notice period, no elaborate severance negotiation, no months-long process to exit a role that isn't working out. That sounds harsh from one angle, and it is. American job security is thinner than almost anywhere in Western Europe. But it cuts the other way too. Because firing is easy, hiring is easy. Because leaving carries little friction, workers move toward better offers constantly, and wages get bid up in the process. Compare that to much of continental Europe, where strong worker protections, mandatory notice periods, and negotiated severance make companies far more cautious about hiring in the first place, a safety net for the people already inside a job, and a higher wall for everyone trying to get one. The result is a labor market that behaves less like a ladder and more like a moving walkway. American workers change employers, industries, even careers, at a pace that would be unusual in Germany or France, where tenure is longer, loyalty is often rewarded structurally through seniority-based pay, and switching jobs can mean forfeiting benefits built up over years. Neither model is simply better. Europe trades mobility for stability. America trades stability for the ability to keep moving toward whatever pays more. So the real number worth noticing isn't the $80,000. It's how often that number changes for the person earning it, and how rarely, in much of Europe, changing employers moves the number at all. 7 ordinary things. A parking lot, a machine that keeps a house cool, a waiting room that moves faster than most, a car with nowhere it can't go, a loan that never changes, A mountain that belongs to no one and everyone. A job market built for leaving. None of them look like a dream from the outside. That's the point. But none of them came free either. The speed in an American hospital sits next to a bill that can still ruin a family. The freedom of the open road sits next to a country that never quite built an alternative to it. The job market that rewards constant movement is the same one that offers almost no safety net when the movement stops. Europe, on the other side of every comparison, chose stability, protection, density, and paid for those choices in wait times, in smaller homes. In summers, it wasn't built to survive. Neither continent solved the same problem. They solved different ones, and each is still living with what it didn't choose. So maybe the American dream was never about being better than anywhere else. Maybe it was always just a bet that speed, space, and convenience were worth more than the certainty Europe built instead. Which raises the only question really worth asking. When it's your turn to choose, which trade-off would you be willing to live with?